Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Julie Goddard. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Food Science at the Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And I'm also a fellow at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. I'm going to be leading today's session on innovation in food packaging and where food packaging sits in the context of waste reduction and more general sustainability themes. So brief kind of run a show. I'm going to be giving a brief keynote address, followed by around 1:15 Eastern, a panel conversation with three exciting thought leaders on the topic. Starting at around 1:45 Eastern, we'll have time for questions from the audience. But first, some housekeeping. As I present and as the group engages in conversation, please type any questions you have into the chat box to the upper right of your screen. If you're in full screen mode, you're going to need to exit full screen mode in order to see the chat icon. If your question happens to be for a particular panelist, please note that in your question and we'll make sure to direct it to them. We'll address the questions at the end of the session after the group conversation. Next slide, please. So today's session has been organized by Grow New York, an annual $3 million food and agricultural startup competition run out of the Cornell Center for Regional Economic Advancement, designed to attract innovation to our region. Applications for this year's competition open on March 31st and will be accepted through July 15th. To learn more about the competition requirements and criteria, please visit grow-ny.com. Next slide. So we're here today to discuss innovative packaging solutions and how they're working to meet the USDA and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's goals for cutting our nation's food waste by 50% by the year 2030, in alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But first, a quick background on me. I have degrees in chemical engineering and food science, and between my bachelor's and my PhD, I worked in the food industry for about 4 years at a major food company as a design engineer. Next slide. So in my current role as a professor, I teach and run a research program in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. The overarching theme of my research program stems from just this observation of how many materials our food interacts with on its journey from farm to fork. From tomato picking bins, to pasteurization equipment, to food packaging. We're learning more and more about how important these materials are in improving the safety and environmental sustainability of our food system. And in my group, we integrate technologies from synthetic biology, polymer chemistry, biochemistry, and more. And we have a few different areas of interest, but today we're going to talk about active packaging. Much of my work in this realm is supported by the Department of Agriculture, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and the Institute of Food Technologists. So many thanks to them for their financial support of my research. Next slide. Chances are, if you've tuned in today, you're already well aware of our current crisis around food waste. But let me just throw a couple staggering statistics your way to help quantify the issue. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, if you estimate the total greenhouse gas emissions from food loss and waste, and compare that to that of the largest greenhouse gas emitting countries, food waste and loss would be third behind only China and the United States. That's huge. And it can help to think of what we consider food waste, right? Which is any edible food not eaten by people for any reason, whether that's due to spoilage, plate waste, so-called ugly fruit syndrome, etc. And when we think about how to tackle this enormous problem, a logical approach is to try to identify where to target interventions to have the biggest impact. And there's a few ways to approach this. So in the next slide, we see that to acknowledge that food waste occurs at all stages of the farm to fork continuum, this supply chain that our food goes on its journey from farm to fork. A decent amount of waste does happen on farm and post-harvest, and the remainder, about half, happens from processing through distribution and retail, and then finally at the consumption level. Interestingly, and we can see this in the next slide, the further along the supply chain the food loss occurs, the more carbon intensive the wastage is. And this makes sense. Consider a tomato. If it's spoiled or damaged during harvest, it's going to have a much lower carbon footprint than tomato sauce wasted by the consumer. since harvest, transportation, processing, advertisement, and all these things accumulates additional greenhouse gases along the supply chain. And these are sort of the hidden environmental costs to food waste. When we envision waste of food, we often think about piles of rotten food. But what we often forget is the real and environmental costs of all the energy, the labor, and the water that goes into producing a given food. And importantly, I've divvied this up in terms of stage of the supply chain of our food system. It's also commodity dependent, right? So a wasted steak, for example, is going to have more of these so-called hidden costs than a wasted tomato. But today's discussion is around innovations in packaging to reduce food waste. So let's refocus our conversation on the post-processing phases of the supply chain. Major ways that producers seek to reduce post-processing spoilage is by processing, for example, pasteurization, use of additives, natural or synthetic, that might help to prevent microbial and chemical spoilage, and finally, packaging, kind of the center of today's discussion, to protect the product from the external environment after production. So in the next slide, we can see that from very historical times to, in the next slide, more recent times, the traditional role of food packaging hasn't changed a whole lot. And that is namely to offer containment of the product, protection from external degradation or mechanical damage, some convenience, and communication. Not shown here, but it's an important role to show nutrition fact panel, product information, allergy information, et cetera. But with increasing interest by consumers and producers alike for clean label products, and we can see in the next slide, this is thinking things like less additives in the foods, maybe all natural, all organic, this kind of thing. There's legitimate concerns that this is going to cause an unintended uptick in food wasted due to food spoilage post-processing, basically a shortening of the shelf life. And that's something that really motivates a lot of my research on how can we innovate packaging technology to do more than simple containment and protection, but to actually actively permit cleaner label products while in parallel reducing food waste and loss post-production. So I want to introduce the concept in the next slide of active packaging. In active packaging, we're designing packaging materials to go beyond the traditional role of packaging of simple containment and protection, and to do something more. For example, improving food safety by incorporation of antimicrobials, reducing spoilage by incorporating antioxidants, maybe sensing environmental changes and then changing the intrinsic properties of the package, or even indicating something to the consumer about the freshness and safety of the product, and more. There's many really cool technologies out there in the literature and in the patent. And I want to propose that the concept of active packaging could be a great opportunity in extending shelf life and thus reducing post-processing food waste. This type of active packaging could even address clean label trends while maintaining good food quality and good shelf life. So first, let's define some differences in the technologies that are commonly explored for active packaging. And that shows up in this next slide here. And this is important to define these differences because it definitely differs how these materials might be regulated both by the FDA and in the European Union. So there's two major categories. First is in kind of the blended or coated realm, where the active agent is intended to go into the food product to exert its activity, whether that's preventing microbial growth or preventing lipid oxidation, et cetera. Now these, because the additive goes into the food for the technical effect, need to be regulated as direct additives. So that's through the food additive petition. So that's an important process, which is very different from this other class of active packaging materials, which are dubbed as immobilized or non-migratory. And this is the area that my research largely focuses in, where we're trying to take these active agents and bind them to the structure of the packaging material so that they're not expected or likely to migrate into the food system. There's a regulatory difference here in that they would need to be approved through as an indirect additive through the food contact notification program. So let's give you just one example from my group's research. If you could please advance to the next slide. So let me just give you one quick example. So it turns out that iron and copper, even in trace part per billion quantities, can initiate a number of spoilage reactions, things like lipid oxidation. If you've ever had really good olive oil and you don't use it and then it smells funky, but also degradation of important nutrients, as well as loss of natural colors. In fact, the end of product shelf life is often marked by these oxidative spoilage pathways. So we know iron is an important culprit in promoting quality and nutritional losses. And in fact, one of the most common synthetic additives, EDTA, is phenomenally effective in binding these ions and preventing those spoilage reactions. But as we want to remove things like EDTA to develop cleaner label products, stability suffers. It simply goes bad faster. And there's really no good natural versions of chelators. So what we've done, and unfortunately this slide isn't showing the animation, but I want you to imagine on the right side there, the ligands with the chemistry showing, that looks very similar to the chemical structure of EDTA, this additive I'm talking about. So what we've tried to do is make a packaging material, and we've done, is to make a packaging material that has chemistry similar to that of EDTA. So you could remove the EDTA from the product, but retain the oxidative stability. And we found in the next slide, we can show that these materials are highly effective in preventing lipid oxidation. In fact, extending shelf life about 5 times compared to a clean label product packaged in a traditional non-active package. And we've tested this all the way down to pH 3, which is important because so many of our foods and beverages are on the acidic side. These materials perform well in increasing viscosities up to a soft gel, similar to a mayonnaise. And we've done other work as well in this realm, where instead of binding a chelating ligand, we've bound antimicrobial agents to prevent the growth of spoilage and pathogenic microorganisms. So that's some of what's being done in my lab. And there's some really cool innovations in other labs and other companies. We're going to hear from Toby Thomas in a little bit from So Fresh about their antimicrobial active packaging technology. And I find it all really fascinating. But as I conclude here, I want to check out this other slide, this next slide, which harkens back to an original slide that I showed. When I describe my research program, and I think this happens commonly in a research setting, and we talk about multidisciplinarianism, it is multidisciplinary. We leverage technologies from a lot of different fields. But if I take my academic blinders off and look at this next slide here, and we think about what might be the real hurdles to translating some of these innovative technologies to be effective in reducing food waste. Next slide again, please. It becomes clear that it's not that transdisciplinary at all, right? It's really just considering my research in these technologies in the limited science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM framework. And for any innovation, packaging, or many other food technologies to reduce food waste, there's hurdles beyond what STEM disciplines can overcome that stand in the way of effective tech transfer. Things like, as we see in this next slide, things like stakeholder engagement, a real good understanding of hurdles in the supply chain, life cycle analysis, whole system characterization, intellectual property, et cetera. And that's where I want to end this keynote and introduce my colleagues whose pictures show up on this next slide here. I want to introduce Kai Robertson, Paola Ependini, and Toby Thomas, who bring really different and really exciting viewpoints to this interesting conversation about how we can look at innovations in packaging as a possible approach to reducing food waste. So with that, I'd like to have my panelists briefly introduce themselves with their backgrounds, interests, and affiliation, and then we'll get on to the meat of this hour, which is a really exciting, engaging discussion. So Kai, please introduce yourself.
Wonderful, thank you, Julie. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Julie asked, let me just give you a little bit of background so you understand where my comments will be coming from. I have been working in and around the food industry for the last 25 plus years. with retailers and CPG companies, as well as NGOs, nonprofits like World Wildlife Fund. So I have a deep expertise and interest in this industry of food, and now work as an independent sustainability consultant. Since 2011, I've been, in quotes, knee-deep working on food loss and waste, which I grant you doesn't sound appealing literally. We can't avoid food-related metaphors in this space. And working on food loss and waste, one of my clients has been the World Resources Institute, who's taken the lead on a lot of the work related to food loss and waste, and I've been serving with as the lead advisor on the food loss and waste protocol. I won't talk much about the protocol, or if at all today, but any of you looking to measure food loss and waste, the protocol and the accounting reporting standard developed is a really useful tool. And then last but not least, on a personal front, I am proud to say that I'm very happy to be participating in this eCornell event, as I am a Cornell alum. So I'll say go Big Red for anybody else who's a Cornellian joining us today. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you. Paula Pendini here. I'm also a proud alum of the Food Science Department at Cornell, and super happy to be here with you. I currently am a principal engineer for the Mars Global Packaging team. My responsibilities include packaging strategy development and capability building, as well as bringing sustainable packaging solutions to our product portfolio. Prior to Mars, I worked at PepsiCo and Kraft Foods for many years on end-to-end packaging solutions and development, including new technologies, commercial innovation, and sustainability. And if you're interested specifically in Mars sustainability initiatives in packaging as well as other areas, I believe there's going to be a link provided, if it's not already, so you can access it. There's a lot of interesting information there. And with that, I'll pass it on to Toby.
Hi, I'm Toby Thomas, president of SoFresh Inc. I'm a packaging engineer with 32 years of food packaging experience with a lot of the same companies that Paula mentioned. I'm now leading a team solving food waste through active packaging, and we are commercial with several companies, and we're a small startup that is emerging in this space of keeping food fresh longer. Thank you.
Can I just say a shout out to our participants today who are already flooding the chat with really exciting questions. So we do have some pre-prepared questions, but I say we hustle up and get right to these really exciting panel or participant questions. Quick housekeeping reminder, as we talk, please type any questions you have, which you're already doing, which is great, in the chat box in the upper right screen. If you're in full screen mode, you'll need to exit full screen in order to see that chat icon. And we will address as many of these questions as we can towards the end of the session. But in the meantime, Kai, can you give us some perspective on the importance of thinking broadly about food loss and waste and the value of packaging as a solution?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And let's show some slides just to give a bit more color to this. I find it's useful to have some visuals. As you know, Julie, you already mentioned, food loss and waste looks different around the world, and it takes place across the food supply chain. I think it's always helpful to just start out simply to think about fundamentally food loss and waste is food not eaten by people for whatever reason, wherever, whenever, whyever that happens. And it's commonly thought of as spoilage. So on this next slide here, you can see, a moldy orange, right? This is what we typically think of as food loss and waste, but it's more than that. A picture in the middle, which will appear here, is plate waste, right? This is from my own household. We have leftovers. Somebody was sick here in my family. They couldn't finish their sandwich. We put it away, and we had to also then discard it because said person was sick. That's for the bagel. I have to say the best solution to food loss and waste actually is like for these little hot dogs you might be able to make out in the top right of the picture. My teenage son scarfed those and ate them within like 3 minutes of them appearing in the fridge. So the solution to a lot of food loss and waste is teenage boys who are hungry. But absent that, of course, we've got packaging solutions. And then the third example of food loss and waste that often is overlooked is what some people call inedible parts. So this is a picture of leftovers from cauliflower head. So it's the stem, it's the leaves, which you can actually perfectly well eat by cutting it up. So we often forget about these, what we make traditionally call inedible parts. We can't eat the banana skin, at least in the U.S., that's not commonly eaten. There are recipes to make banana bread with banana peels. These inedible parts that we make for granted are also useful food parts and part of this food loss and waste discussion. Also just want to add to the points that you made about the hidden costs. So in this next slide, you'll see the kind of tip of the iceberg, which is the disposal cost. It costs, of course, money to buy food that you then pay to take away. That's a visible cost. Below that, though, there are a number of hidden invisible costs. And you've alluded to those, Julie, about the lost materials, energy costs, embedded labor, water. On average, really the true cost, if we took true cost accounting as an MBA graduate, I think it's really important to think about these externalities as well. What's the true cost of the wasted materials? And it's about 10 times the cost of disposal. And then also you mentioned the GHG impacts. I just want to add to that a little bit. So from a greenhouse gas perspective, of course, there's embedded greenhouse gases, but there's also water that if you look at across different products, on the next slide, you'll see an example where if we're talking about, say, tomatoes or bananas, the water wasted, embedded in all the growing and producing of these products, it varies, right? So in the equivalent of a shower, you take a 5-minute shower, that's about the amount of water for growing a tomato. It's a much longer shower if you're, we'll throw away a banana. And on the bottom of the slide, you'll see if you were to throw away a pound equivalent amount of beef, that is a 6-hour shower. So the embedded resource do matter. And so when we're looking at the trade-offs about where to apply additional resources to reduce loss and waste and what the overall life cycle impact is, these are some of the aspects to take into consideration. And then last but not least, again, just to think about the hierarchy of food loss and waste reduction. This pyramid on the next slide shows you by EPA, also adopted by the USDA and many around the world, this kind of inverted pyramid where the top is really the most preferred option. Step one, prevent the food loss and waste from being generated in the first place. And that's where packaging can play a really important role. Below that, it's also really important to feed hungry people that which cannot be sold, and then other destinations where food may go if it has to leave the human food system. So I think these framing pieces are really helpful to put into context our discussion, which can get really specific about packaging, but this is useful uber umbrella type aspects to keep in mind as we're having this conversation today.
Those are excellent points. Thank you, Kai. Paola, can you offer us some industry perspective on how things like supply chain drive required shelf life?
Sure. And I think you touched base on a lot of maybe some of the things that I'll say, but I think it's really important to remind ourselves what the main function of a packaging is among the many functions, but it is really to contain and protect the food. We use packaging to prevent food spoilage and damage, as you said, from the moment the food is harvested, when it's distributed, kept in the retail, all the way to the home until it's consumed. So shelf life of the product in a primary packaging is clearly an important factor in preventing the food waste, but it's not the only one from a packaging perspective. So damage in transportation, for example, it's a huge problem, and it also plays a role. So designing appropriate, say, corrugate, which is simple, sounds simple compared to active packaging, but even designing well your corrugate to prevent such damage is really critical. Regarding the shelf life, this is going to be driven by many factors, including what's the nature of the product? Is it a processed product? Is it a fresh product? Is it a dry product? Also, the complexity of the distribution. Is it a local distribution, national? Is it global? And also, do you need temperature control? Can it be just shipped ambient? So all these factors really contribute. Another factor is the retail operations, what kind of retailer it is, where is it located, what are their guidelines, what are their inventories, their rotation strategies, et cetera, regulations, and of course, what packaging technologies are available, not state of the art, technologies and technologies available, but where are they available? Because you cannot maybe find the same things everywhere, right? So all these factors play a role. You talked a lot about active packaging. I think there are also many other ways to prevent food spoilage across the supply chain. For example, cold chain shipping with the rising of e-commerce. A lot of the foods that spoil, and even that not necessarily spoil, but in my case, you know, at Mars, we ship chocolate, so it melts, right? So, you know, that's an important area to focus on. There's a lot of new innovations coming from smart packaging in IoT, AI, sensors, things like that. Those also play a role in the supply chain by being able to monitor the distribution, things like that. And even at the level of consumers, there are simple things that we can design as reclose systems that, although not require great chemistries and so forth, you know, they can help, you know, prolong the shelf life of your foods at home. So those are just some of the examples.
That's great. And Paula, I think actually the next slide might be something that, if you don't mind, just going a little bit off off the direction here to kind of show, I guess, that there's a cost and a feasibility thing, and it's, you know, how you pick which intervention to go to is going to depend on so many different factors. But I didn't know if you wanted to highlight a couple points from this slide.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just thinking about it, you know, for example, at Corrigan, right? That's a pretty cheap technology and it can take you a long way. So that's pretty feasible, widely available. And if 50% of your damage comes from, you know, things get destroyed in you know, the truck, you know, that's where you should focus your efforts. But in the case, say, of an active packaging where you have, you know, a very clean, organic type of food, which, you know, you need to have a certain shelf life. Otherwise, you don't have enough time to get it all the way to the consumer's home. That's another important point, right? Shelf life is not always like, oh, we want it to last forever. It's really driven by all these different things. So if I have that expensive product that took so much, you know, energy and input of different things like Kai was expecting, you want that to stay and remain good, then probably it's worth to add better technology to keep it longer so that the consumer can consume it the way it was intended to be consumed. So
these are fantastic points. Thank you, Paula.
Yep.
Toby, on to you. Your company, So Fresh, won $500,000 in this year's Grow New York competition. First of all, congratulations. That's enormous. And I'd like to hear from you your thoughts on the opportunities startups can offer in this space, and just describe your company's technology.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, and we are so grateful to Grow New York. Winning an award from them has meant a lot to our company, and it's helping us go from a startup to an emerging company. And so we are a startup, and we're solving food loss and food waste with active packaging technologies. So if you looked on my kitchen counter or in my refrigerator, at times you would see probably that loaf of bread, or you'd see moldy raspberries inside the refrigerator. It's a frustrating waste of food and money. Next slide. Oops. Okay. So Fresh is making a difference for bakeries. Customers want better for you foods, like we talked about previously. For baked goods, that means organic, artisanal, clean label, gluten-free, preservative-free choices. Now, if all bakeries could deliver that cost effectively, it'd be better food for everyone, and they would increase their sales. Next slide. Our solution delivers a natural food ingredient in a vapor form to the inside of a bakery bag. Okay, we are specifically working on improving bread from becoming moldy and becoming food waste. Our technology has an active ingredient that fills the airspace around the food interacting with the mold spores to inhibit mold colonies from growing and forming and becoming visible, at which time most people take that loaf of bread or that container of strawberries and either cull through it or they throw it out. But whatever they're doing, they're generating food waste. So it's a simple technology, but it took us a long time to solve this problem. We have several patents pending. We started this work in 2020 with my associate, Bill Belias. Now we have a product in market, and we are solving the problem for bakeries today. Next slide. Our product are pictured in this slide, and they're sold as wicket packs. That is the current packaging format for bakeries. They put that wicket pack on their filling lines, and they blow the bag open, push the loaf of bread in, and it goes off and gets a twist tie or a plastic clip put on it, and a date stamp. And so we're providing this active packaging in the exact same format they use today, so there's going to be no capital that's required for these bakeries. The bakeries that are using SoFresh, they're enjoying less expired and spoiled returns. That saves them lots of cost. And so every time they bake a loaf of bread and package it, they put a sell-by date on. And that is like the average time for the product to be sold, and then a few extra days for the consumer to consume. But if you go on vacation or you're on a business trip like the old days, you come home and boom, the bread has gone stale or moldy, and the berries are, become soupy, and you end up throwing them out. Now, with SoFresh packaging, the bakeries can get longer shelf life. And so the bakeries can now sell all the bread they bake instead of overproducing. Next slide. So we're in store with several bakeries, and these bakeries they produce the premium baked items, organic, gluten-free, and their products originally last about 4 days on shelf, which means you have to go to the store and replace the product, twice a week, every 4 days or so. With the 4-day shelf life, you have to remove all the product from your previous delivery, and that adds up to about 30% of wasted product. With SoFresh, we can take that 4-day shelf life and give you 14 to 21 days, depending on what you need. That gives you more time for that product to be sold, and that's more time for us consumers to enjoy that food. But going from 30% spoilage down to almost 0% spoilage represents a big loss in the cost to make that product, and it also increases your sales by 28% because that product isn't being pulled off the shelf, and so it gets sold. So the net improvement is about 17 cents per unit, or about 154% net income increase by our calculations. Next slide, please. So we have a case study right there in Ithaca Bakery, and this is how I'm attached to Cornell between Grow, New York, and working with this wonderful bakery in Ithaca, New York. They make great organic bread and bagels, and they're sold in the region. And if you go to Cornell, you enjoy that product when it's because it gets sold into the university. Today or before, they make 2 weekly deliveries to the stores, and they would sell 70% of those baked goods, and 30% would be returned because they had a 4-day shelf life. Now, since using SoFresh as their packaging solution, the owner of Ithaca Bakery told us the other week that their returns have dropped to 2%, and that they are never going back to the old package. Ithaca Bakery now plans to sell on the internet and to ship their bagels and bread to alumni all over the United States. So we are springboarding off of these successes to grow our sales, and thanks to Grow New York contests and the mentors supporting us, we are going to have manufacturing in upstate New York within the next 6 months. And that's our journey on solving food waste with an active package that we are selling into bakeries today.
Toby, that is a really great case study, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners and participants today have some connection at some point through Ithaca, New York, and remember fondly Ithaca Bakery. So thanks, that's really great. So we have some questions that we're going to go through with our panelists, as well as some really exciting questions that are coming in through the chat, so keep that coming. I want to start by asking, outside of what we've talked about so far, and any of you panelists can pick up, but I think probably Paola in particular, and Kai as well, and Toby as well. You've all got great and different perspectives. What do you see are the biggest challenges that the industry faces, or even more broadly, the food system, right? Because we've got industry, and as some of our chat folks have pointed out, we've got regulations, we've got environmental, agencies and so forth. So what are some of the biggest challenges that the food system faces to prevent food and packaging waste, while at the same time delivering products with cleaner label claims, excuse me?
I can start and just give the packaging perspective of it. But if you think about it, the packaging industry has spent years developing efficient systems and materials that deliver the best quality, products at the lowest cost possible for producers and consumers. So for me, the biggest challenge now is how do you maintain this level of protection and efficiency, but with a packaging that has reduced environmental impact, right? Like compostable or recyclable materials and packages. That's one big challenge, I think. The other one is, in my mind, there's a lot of emergence of new transaction channels. So, e-commerce, I mentioned before, you're seeing more mobile vending, all these things that are trying to get the products closer to consumers, but that really fragments, the supply chain. So it has a big impact on the supply chain, and thus it will have a big impact, on the shelf life and the quality of the foods. So I would say those two race to the top for me.
That's great. Kai or Toby, did you want to chime in on this one?
Just a quick chime in on the piece related to, one of the biggest challenges is always mindsets. And we, many of us probably can recall as consumers, somebody in our family saying, clean your plate, children are starving elsewhere in the world. There had been in the generation and before us, much more of an emphasis and focus on not making the most of everything, really reducing our waste. That shifted some in the last 30, 50 years, and it can shift again the other direction. So I think one of the challenges is having people think more about their food. And when you think more about your food, where it comes from, where it's going if you throw it away, that mindset shift really helps, because I love what Toby's creating, the packages to make the food last longer through the supply chain. When it gets to my house or the customer's house, we still need to eat it in time, right? And think about the fact that food is perishable. So this mindset shift to really thinking more about our food, which the pandemic, oddly enough, has actually encouraged more of us to do, is to think about our food and where it comes from. And I think that's just an ongoing challenge. And there's many solutions and many people trying to shift consumers' mindsets.
For me, I think some of the biggest challenges are, the diversity in foods that we consume daily need different types of solutions. And our solution, works fantastic on molds, spoilage, and really stales, things like that, which is great for trees and berries and bread and some other things. But that's just a very small portion of what we consume. And so we need more innovations in and around all the different types of foods that we consume. And the trend is to go to fresh foods. So being able to keep fresh foods longer, which there's been a big history of solutions in the area. I just think to help minimize food waste, we need to just keep bringing these innovations to market. And the second thing, to Paula's point, is sustainability is really important, and so bringing these solutions that are compostable, that are recyclable, is really important, and have a pathway from saving the food is fantastic, but then being able to deal with the packaging which is necessary after you consume the food is going to be a big challenge. And there's great strides happening in that area. And we're going to be right there with them, making sure our system works with a compostable and a recyclable type product.
This is great. I think the best kind of panel discussion is one where the answers raise more things that can spark more conversations. And actually, I'm seeing a lot of threads of interest in some of the panel's discussion that reflect very much questions that our participants are having. And I want to speak to that. A few of us have talked about, and Harriet in the chat has mentioned about, are there more environmentally friendly ways to create active packaging? Specifically around this idea of throwing plastic at a solution to improve the environmental, challenges. And that's an excellent point. And to what Toby just said, and I think Kai alluded to, in my group, we joke about, the holy grail of active packaging, right, would be something bio-derived, biodegradable, and active in preventing food spoilage and loss. And I think this was in another, EK mentioned about this issue of short-term durability of some of these bio-derived and biodegradable materials. And that's another element of research that needs to be conducted, is in making these bio-derived and biodegradable materials actually perform, right? And to perform in preventing, say, moisture from transmitting into the product, or oxygen, or whatever it is. And often when you manipulate the chemistries of these bio-derived and biodegradable materials to perform well in protecting the product, you do adversely impact their biodegradability. But there's really interesting efforts being going on in these ways, and so I'm excited about that. Kai, you talked about some of the other challenges outside of kind of food industry and packaging of adopting some of these packaging sustainability issues or initiatives, and you mentioned specifically, that's great, you can make it keep a long time, but then I take it into my house, so there's kind of this awareness of the consuming behavior. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure, I can. I think, just when we put it packaging in a food loss and waste context, there's a number of aspects that packaging can influence, right? So it's more, you mentioned and what Toby's offering is the behind the scenes, right? The packaging that allows the food to last longer, and you can start with that back at farm level, right? So the food can make it all the way to retail without spoilage. But when we get to the consumer side, packaging is also obviously really helpful to, enable people to see what's inside, to see what's going on. Is the product becoming moldy? Packaging plays an important role in portion control. So there's really a big piece, a lot of times, and I hear this regularly from people I know who live in single households, they just cannot finish the size of the package that they buy. So whether it's a can of beans or any number of products, there's more than one serving, and there's trade-offs, right? Because if you make a smaller package, you have more material per amount of food, but you also can reduce food loss and waste. So there's a whole lot of trade-offs and life cycle analyses that come into play in making these decisions. And then last but not least, there's an important role of date labels. We haven't talked about that, but what's printed on the package can also be really important. And in the UK, there's been a lot of experimentation with labeling that says, what to do with the food, right? If you can't eat this right away, freeze it, right? Or if you can't, here are some leftover recipes. Hellman's just came out with a big food waste campaign about how mayonnaise can be a source of a solution to encourage more use of leftovers, right? So there's a lot of real estate on packages as well that could be used as a means to encourage consumers to change their buying behaviors and habits.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Kai. And I like all those efforts. They're wonderful. The one thing we have seen in certain baked goods is product is flash frozen, and then it goes through the cold chain, thawed out, and then goes on the store shelf. And when we do the sort of engineering analysis and the cost analysis for that product, it can be upwards to 50 cents a unit that you're spending on cold chain, which gets to sustainability as well. And taking that product home and tossing it into the freezer, which is what happens in our household until we can get to that loaf of bread again, adds to that, really the hidden costs of that product. And so trying to get the total solution and the low cost solution, I think, is really good for all of us. So
this is a great transition. Reggie early on had asked the cost of those active packaging compared to conventional packaging. And there's no simple answer to most of these wonderful questions that you all are raising, but obviously that's going to depend on the technology, right? And also how you consider the cost. To Toby's point, there is the cost of producing it, right? Which I think, Toby, you can agree that it costs a little more. Yeah.
Yep.
And there's approaches to minimize that added cost for sure. And I always think too, I always like to remind, family and friends and stuff when I talk about my research. I look at like my watch and my computer and I think of that technology. And 10 years ago, if you had told me that would be at a cost effective rate of something that I would adopt or I would want enough to pay that much for, I would have said, no way. And so I argue that there's always that, like, I don't know how people make this cost effective, but they figure it out. Technology development can do that. But to that point, let's say, okay, it does cost a little more, but there are these costs, and Toby, you can speak to that, right? The product saved, the distribution, maybe you don't have to rely on a cold chain anymore.
Yeah. So, we if you talk about bread bags, they've been around for 60 to 70 years. They haven't changed much. They're not thinner, and they've gotten more colors and more detail on the print, but that form factor to hold a loaf of bread or a package of bagels has not changed in a long time. And so we're bringing active technology to that space, and it is a lot more costly. I mean, we're using an active ingredient that's expensive. We're doing multi-layer components in order to keep the active ingredient inside the package instead of outside the package. And so the cost is high. What we're looking at is the value delivered to the bakeries and to the consumers. Consumers get product they like, they're going to repeat buy. That's good for the baker. If you look at 30% waste, that's 30% cost of goods that gets tossed out. So that gets actually priced into the wholesale price and the retail price. And so if we can solve that problem, that savings can then be transferred to the consumer. Okay, and it always will be transferred to consumer because of the price, supply and price effect. And so when you look at the value, we're returning to the baker in certain cases where it's an organic product, 284% ROI on certain products. And so that's not for everything, but it is for the $5 and $6 and $7 loaf of bread with 30% waste and a 4-day shelf life. We're able to show real improvements, even at an elevated cost of packaging, and it is elevated. We're much more than a standard printed bread bag.
And if I can add, Toby,
please, yes.
It's definitely a holistic view to the cost because of the savings you may have preventing waste, but you also need to see, you can reach, you can increase your business. Oh, so from your point of view, now Ithaca Bakery is reaching, all the alum in the nation, right? Yeah. So their business grows, but you could take the same lens for areas where you cannot reach, with fresh produce or things like that, these desert cities, things of that nature, where now you have an opportunity not only to grow the business, but give access of those things to others. So I think you cannot just focus on the cost. And there's always a cost of entry, right, for new technologies. And that's the other thing. We need to learn that, it's going to cost us, and through time we'll keep optimizing. But if we never go there, how can we optimize? So,
correct. Yeah.
This is great. So I'm not going to be able to get to everybody's question, but I got to get to this one question from Gail Goddard because we share a last name and there's not a lot of Goddards out there. And it's a great question. So as a consumer, she asks, how can we engage with the food industry to let them know we're interested in this, willing to pay more, et cetera? With a follow-up question on state regulation legislation as part of this effort. And that points to an amazing and important observation of how complicated it is to get technologies like this accepted by consumers and producers, and then also through the regulatory hurdles. So I guess, Paola, if you can speak about how best consumers can engage with food industry, and then Kai and Toby, if you can speak to some of the regulatory things in the way of kind of adopting new technologies for reducing food waste.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the biggest expertise of how to do that, but obviously, you know, with social media and the growth of all these, there's a lot of ways you can access companies to let them know what you're thinking, from product reviews to, you know, putting things online to actually contact. The products always have the contact number that you can contact, you know, to provide verbatims of what you're experiencing. So I think there's different ways, right, to connect with the food industry. And what was the second part? I'm sorry.
Well, I want to open it up to Kai and Toby as well, if you've got perspectives on engaging with food industry. And this is a great question, right? Because when you think of the consumer with any new technology, right? The consumer, as we say that word, always tends to feel like it's the person eating the food, but the person licensing that technology is a company like SoFresh or the, you know, that's, so it's different levels of the supply chain. But the second part of the question is, what about the state regulation or legislation part of these efforts?
Go ahead, Kai, if you want to. I'll follow up.
Yes, I'll let you, Toby, describe the state regulation aspect, because I'm less familiar with that, except for as it relates to date labeling, where the Harvard Food Law and Policy Center or Clinic has done a lot of work on looking at date labels and other packaging, that kind of packaging related work. On the consumer side, I mean, having worked in the sustainability field for many years now, I often hear companies say, when customers tell us something matters, it is so helpful for making the changes that we're advocating for. So to Paola's point, let the company know. It takes a little work, you know, whether it's an email or call. But when the consumer affairs professional within the company is armed with consumers actually saying we want something changed, it really helps build a business case internally for why to invest in a change. Because as we've been talking about, there is a cost. Change always is, you know, nobody likes change but babies. So yes, just, you know, use your voice in your wallet.
And just quickly on the consumer, one thing that obviously I forgot to mention, we do a lot of consumer insights, a ton. We use different, you know, we just do so much. So we know where the trends are going. We know where the consumers are looking for solutions, et cetera. Sorry, Toby.
Yeah,
go ahead.
That's a great point. I was going to make that point is, you know, participate in focus groups and tell CPG companies what you want. And that's the best way to get action. On the regulation side, it's really, anytime you modify packaging or come up with some new packaging, you have to go through the FDA, okay? And so the regulations are, you know, go through a food contact notice. You have to do your homework in that. You have to do the microbiology, and you have to make sure your changes are adequate and safe. And the FDA looks at that information, and then they tell you, yes, we agree, and then you move on. And we have submitted that information, and since we're using a food ingredient to actively suppress a fungus, some mold spores of fungus, it was very easy to go through that process. Whether it's state, I guess states could legislate the use of the product, but I'd rather show the benefit and you know, have a groundswell of companies making this type of packaging and solving all the different food problems, and then growing it that way, because food waste costs a lot of money and it pays for itself. And so I think innovation can actually do that. And I had one other thought, but it has escaped me. Sorry.
No, these are excellent points. And it's a good question. And I should note that because I teach a little bit about this at an intro level, our food regulatory system is complicated and complex. But I can say in the framework of the approval of new food contact materials like packaging or active packaging, there's a rigorous protocol. It requires a lot of safety testing, toxicology assessments, and things like that. So it is with great thought and careful consideration that the FDA, approves or doesn't a new material, and that's an important point to make. We are coming to our last 4 minutes here, and I don't want to miss a couple real important points. So very quickly, Kai, there's a question directly from Beth Barrett. There was a tool you mentioned in your introduction that was used to measure food waste and loss. Can you name that again for us?
Yeah, sure. And perhaps the folks can put it in the chat as well. It's the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, which was produced by the Food Loss and Waste Protocol. So the website is flwprotocol.org. There's tons of resources on there. Feel free to reach out to me through LinkedIn or otherwise if you have questions about using that.
That's great. And then Toby, Ian has some kind of questions, thoughts, ideas for you and your So Fresh technology. And that's really looking at other foods other than the berries and the breads as a possible application, or even animal feed as a technology to reduce molds. And then even specifically reducing aflatoxins in agricultural crops such as maize.
Yeah. So that's where we want to head. As we grow this company and bring on more people, is going after the pathogenic bacteria that are a food safety concern and also a food waste concern. And so there are a lot of different areas that we've been asked to look at, and we're starting to do some of that research definitely on berries and on cauliflower that generates the black mold that you see as it spoils, and broccoli. Even to products that generate a lot of black mold, which is grains from field to mill, as well as products like hemp. Like this year, the hemp industry lost 50% of its production due to black mold. And so there's opportunities outside of bread and cheese and berries, and we're going to be addressing those as our company grows. One, we still haven't done the fundamental research that says, yes, our technology works on that. So we have some background to work. We have some work to do.
That's excellent. Toby, Kai, Paula, this has been an amazing conversation. There's so much more we could talk about and I think need to talk about. And I think engaging in this way across disciplines and with different perspectives is arguably one of the most important ways that we can identify challenges and seek really innovative, exciting solutions, whether it's through packaging innovations or anything else. Kai, I really like your perspective of let's remember that life cycle, right? Not only of the product, but of the package. You make an improvement here, does it hurt things there? And kind of look at the full systems approach. So I want to remind our participants that a link to the recording of this webinar will be available right here on this page following the event. I want to again thank Grow New York, who's organized today's event. Grow New York is an annual $3 million food and ag startup competition. Applications, and I think this might be in the next slide, if we're still doing slides here, open on March 31st and are accepted through July 15th. You can learn more about this and everything else that Grow New York has a hand in at grow-ny.com. Finally, I really want to thank Dr. Paola Appendini, Kai Robertson, and Toby Thomas for joining me in our conversation today, to Grow New York and eCornell for organizing the session, and to you, the audience, for your active participation, your amazing questions. I'm sorry we got through just a fraction of them, but hopefully we addressed some of the key ones that were coming through. So again, I thank you all and hope you'll participate in other webinars like this.
Thank you, Julie.